So hello and welcome to this NPTEL course entitled 20th Century Fiction, where we're looking at T.S. Eliot's poem The Wasteland. And in this section, this lecture, we'll begin with the third section of the poem, which is entitled The Fire Sermon. Now, it's also about human relationships. Like last time we saw how the section before this was entirely about the failing human relationships, the failing human communication, the collapse and the crisis of communication, and how that spills over into other forms of collapses and other forms of crisis in sexual relationships, crisis in intimacy, etc. And also how even human body and human relationships, they get degenerated into waste and trash, right? So the production of waste and trash is something which we see as a recursive phenomenon in the wasteland. The only thing that grows is rubbish. The only thing that grows is waste. The only thing that grows is deadness. Right, so the only production possible, or the only possible production in this particular landscape is the production of waste, the production of deadness, etc. So the very first section we found how the image of the corpse planted inside the soil and how that is sort of growing into something, beginning to sprout. So that image itself was a carrier, was sort of convey the fact that fertility over here is not about regeneration, or reproduction doesn't necessarily entail regeneration in wasteland. So, and that's the whole title of the poem. That's the biggest issue in this poem, the biggest theme in the poem: the production and consumption of waste. Now, the third section, the fire sermon, it continues with that production and consumption of waste in terms of how human relationships, sexual relationships, they keep degenerating into things which are essentially mechanistic in quality, essentially trash-like in quality. And also, if you take a look at the natural landscape over here, I mean, this actually becomes the entire city, the entire River Thames over here, it becomes a reservoir of rubbish. A reservoir of waste and trash and garbage, right? So garbage, waste, trash, these things are mentioned over and over again, etc. So, if you take a look at the opening section, the fire sermon, and this should be on the screen, where the speaker is saying, "The river's tent is broken, the last fingers of leaf clutch and sink into the wet bank. The wind crosses the brown land unheard. The nymphs are departed, sweet Thames runs softly till I end my song. The river bears no empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, or other testimony of summer nights. The nymphs are departed, and their friends, the loitering heirs of city directors departed, have left no addresses." Now, it's an excellent example of the combination of the mythic and the contemporary, right? So if you take a look at the markers over here, empty bottles, sandwich papers, silk handkerchiefs, cardboard boxes, cigarette ends, these are contemporary markers of entertainment and leisure, etc. Picnic, human entertainment, human leisure, etc. So all these activities, all these markers are reflective of certain kinds of activities, right? So testimony of summer nights, human enjoyment. Now, the city doesn't have any of these things anymore, which is to say that there's no marker, there's no residual marker of human fun, of human happiness left in this particular river. Everything's come to an end. The nymphs have departed. So the nymphs of a river, the nymphs of a sea are traditionally mythical figures of entertainment, mythical figures, the sirens who sing songs, who produce music from water bodies. You saw that figure, and we saw it in the ending of the love song on G. Alfred Prufrock, where there was an image of mermaids singing to the speaker. So again, the mermaids over there, they represented that mythical figure, the mythical music coming out of water bodies. Now, the nymphs are departed. Now, look at the way in which the nymphs are recontextualized in this modern setting. So who are the nymphs? The nymphs are departed, and the friends, the loitering heirs of city directors. So the city directors are London directors, the directors of big companies in the city, and the heirs of those companies, the heirs of those directors, the children, maybe the sons and the daughters, the nymphs are the friends of those people. So again, there's a very negative connotation about nymphs over here. So these may be people, these may be women who are mistresses of certain kind of people, privileged people, and they have departed, right? So the River Thames becomes a body of degeneration over here, a body of garbage, a body of trash, a body of waste over here. And waste, of course, is not just a physical phenomenon in the wasteland. Waste also becomes an affective phenomenon, affective, affective phenomenon. It's a mood, it's a certain kind of sentiment, the sentiment of waste, the sentiment of rubbish. That becomes the primary sentiment, the primary effect in this particular poem. Now, if you just go back and keep reading the section, there's a reference again made to Philomel, and if you remember, Philomel was mentioned in the previous section, where again, the whole idea of Philomel being a voiceless woman, a woman whose body has been brutalized sexually, and she becomes the figure of someone who has been victimized and brutalized and rendered agency-less, right? So the agency-lessness of the female figure is something which is represented by the mythical character of Philomel, right? So she represents sexual violence, she represents the voicelessness, etc., and she becomes a very potent figure in this particular poem as well, because she represents the condition of modernity, the condition of the woman in modernity more specifically. And we find in this particular section there is an image of a woman, there's a figure of a woman, a character of a woman, who again is very, very voiceless, and whose body again is brutalized and sexually attacked by a male, by a predatory male who just comes and attacks her and causes violence to her sexually, and then departs immediately after. So the reference to Philomel and Tiresias, the king who violated her, is mentioned over here. Twit, 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 jog, 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 so rudely forced to rear. Right, so Philomel was converted into a bird. So these sounds are onomatopoeic descriptions of bird sounds. So this is the only thing that she can speak, she can say, she can communicate through bird sounds, which are obviously ununderstandable. No one can understand what she's saying. And again, this becomes a very important theme in Wasteland, the ununderstandability. So no one can understand what is being said. So what you say, what you articulate is never understood. And this ununderstood condition, or the ununderstandability in human voices over here, becomes a very important theme in the Wasteland. And very quickly, we'll find that soon after this, we'll find the image of Tiresias who will come in. Now, Tiresias is a classical prophet figure. Now, Tiresias is an androgynous figure. He has male as well as female features, right? So his body becomes a combination of both features, and then he is essentially the blind prophet. So he's blind, and also the other thing about Tiresias is nothing that he will say will be believed. So he's a prophet, but he's not a powerful prophet. He's someone who can see through situations. He's someone who can has an intuition, a knowledge of things, what will come now, what will come after, but he will never be able to make himself understood, and that's a very important phenomenon over here. Okay, so we have different figures crisscrossing each other, mythical figures, contemporary figures, topical figures, historical figures. They all coming together to create a sense of degeneration, an effective degeneration, which is what this poem is all about. Again, we cut back into the image of an unreal city, a cinematic image, a panoramic cinema shot of London, unreal city under the brown fog of a winter noon. So again, the brown fog settling in slowly. It's like a slow motion camera who's looking at the city, a panoramic city, and the fog becomes obviously a very symbolic presence in the city. It becomes an image of spectrality, it carries an image of claustrophobia, it carries an image of non-clarity, etc. So non-clarity, spectrality, claustrophobia are all represented in this image of the fog settling in, or the experience of seeing the fog settling in slowly in an unreal city. So the unreality of London is obviously part of the human disconnect that the inhabitants have over here. No one can connect to anyone else over here. Every connection is superficial, every connection is mechanistic, every connection is degenerative in quality, right? And that's something which the Wasteland keeps harping on over and over again. Mr. Eugenitz, a Smyrna merchant, unshaven, with a pocket full of currants, CF London, documents at sight, asked me in Demotic French to luncheon at the Cannon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. So again, if you take a look at these images, a lunch at the Cannon Street Hotel, followed by a weekend at the Metropole. So the merchant coming and asking someone out for a lunch, and followed by a weekend. So obviously these are indicative of very degenerative sexual activities about human relationships, which are very, very clandestine in quality, very secretive in quality, and obviously very negative in quality. The way it is represented, it's a quick lunch at a seedy hotel, followed by a weekend at a Metropole, which is obviously about having illicit sex, and that is something which keeps coming up again and again in the Wasteland. So unshaven, a pocket full of currents. Again, markers of degeneration, markers of unhealthiness. So this is entirely about unhealthiness. There's no health or harmony in the human relationships in the wasteland. And that spills over into spiritual, sexual, communicative relationships as well. Okay. And then we have this whole idea of Tiresias coming in as a mythical figure, a mythical prophet. And again, look at the way in which the mythical figure and the machinic figure are combined together. So the mythical and the machinic combine together and to create a very interesting entanglement of confusion and degeneration in the wasteland. And I have an article, I have a published article on this, which I'm happy to upload in the portal, which is entirely about how the humans are mechanized and how the machines are humanized in the wasteland, and how that combination, how the transition of humans into machines, mythical figures into mechanistic figures, how that actually underlines the degenerative quality of human relationships in the wasteland, which is what this poem is all about. Okay, so at the violet hour, when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk. So again, the eyes on the back are turning upward from the desk at the violet hour, the twilight hour, when the day is coming to an end. That's the only time when the eyes leave the desk, when the back leaves the desk, which is to say, for the entirety of the day, the eyes on the back are stuck to the desk in a very mechanistic kind of existence. So it's not really a productive existence. You're working, but not being productive, because, you know, the work that you do is alienating you further from any existential, meaningful understanding of life. Right, so this is a classic example of alienation followed by reification, commodification. The human body is converted to commodity, and that commodification, the process of commodification, is generating the sense of alienation, or loneliness. So this is an example of metropolitan alienation. In a city, you feel most alienated. In a city, you feel most alienated inside a crowd. So the entire idea of the unreal city, surrounded by full of crowds of people who have fogs over them, that becomes an example of alienation. That becomes a very graphic representation of alienation in a metropolis. Okay, so at the violet hour, when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk, when the human engine waits like a taxi, throbbing, waiting. So again, look at the way in which the human engine, the human body is considered or classified, described as an engine, like a taxi, throbbing and waiting. So a taxi waiting for, to pick up people is like a throbbing machine. It's something which is waiting, it's not really moving, it's pulsating and it's throbbing. And the human body is described as a similar kind of machine. So again, look at the way in which the human body, the organic body, is described as a mechanistic thing, as a machinic thing, as a machinic entity. So this is what I mean when I just said that the humans are machinized or mechanized in a wasteland, the machines are humanized in a wasteland. So it is an example of dehumanization. I, Tiresias, though blind, throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breasts, can see at the violet hour, the evening hour that stripes homeward and brings the sailor home from sea. So again, the figure of Tiresias comes in, and if you take a look at the scholarship in Wasteland, we find that Eliot had mentioned that Tiresias is a seeing eye in the poem. So he's a presence, he's a figure through which the entire activities of Wasteland are focalized. You know, the example, the meaning of focalization. So focalization is a camera term, a visual term through which, for instance, a story unfolds through a certain consciousness, through a certain person's eyes. The story is told to you through a certain person's eyes. And that process of mediating the story through a certain person's eyes is called focalization. You're focusing on a particular person, and the entire event, the entire activity, all the images are unfolding from that position or perspective, from that perspectival position. So that's an example of focalization. So Tiresias is a focalized figure here. Whatever happens in Wasteland, this particular poem, whatever images are generated and visualized and represented, take place through the focus of Tiresias. Now, obviously, there's an irony over here, because Tiresias, as we know, physically is a blind prophet. So we have a very interesting entanglement over here between blindness and insight. So because he's a prophet, he has insight. He has a special privileged understanding of knowledge, a privileged glimpse, a privileged intuition, a privileged insight into knowledge and life. But also because he's blind, he's physically unable to see it, right? So this is the price he has to pay for insight, blindness. So blindness is a price he has to pay for insight. And of course, he is an androgynous figure, which is to say he's male as well as female. So he's always throbbing between two lives. And again, look at the way in which the mythical figure throbbing between two lives as compared to a taxi throbbing and waiting. So something very banal, something very mundane, something very topical has been compared to something very mythical and mystical. So this combination of the mundane and the mystical, the mundane and the mythical, is something which happens throughout the Wasteland, which makes the poem very, very sort of mythic in quality as well as very contemporary in quality. So Tiresias speaks in a first-person voice over here, and he says, I, Tiresias, though blind, I can see at the violet hour, the twilight hour, when the evening, when the sailor comes home from sea. So what do I see now? I see the typist coming at tea time. So again, we cut back into London, we cut back into present time, present contemporary London, where the typist comes back home after a hard day's work. The typist home at tea time, clears her breakfast, lights the stove, and lays out food in tins. So again, look at the markers, very, very important. So the typist comes home at tea time, and that's the only time that she can clear her breakfast, which is to say that she had left home immediately after breakfast, and she had departed home, and she had been outside all the day. And now she has the time finally to clear her breakfast. And what is she having? She's having food in tins, so tin food, not homemade food, not organic food, not something that is homegrown and homemade and healthy. So tin food essentially and symbolically represents unhealthy food, something which is fast and consumed, almost contaminated and perhaps toxic in quality, something which is preserved artificially, right? And this artificial preservation of food is something which is being hinted at over here in this tin food that she is having. Okay. Out of the window, perilously spread, her drying combinations touched by the sun's last rays. So the dying sun is touching her combinations, the dresses outside. On the divan are piled at night her bed, stockings, slippers, camisoles and stays. I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled ducks, perceive the scene and foretold the rest. So I can perceive the scene with my wrinkled breast, with my blindness, and because I'm a prophet, I can foretell, I can prophesize what's going to happen, and yet I'm an important prophet because I can't articulate. No one was going to believe me, and I can't see anything for physical reality, right? I too awaited the expected guest. So we have a guest coming in, and again, this will be an example of a very unhealthy and degenerative sexual relationship, something which has been hinted at even before, at the example of this Mr. Eugenides coming in and asking a human figure, presumably the speaker, to have lunch with him at a Cannon Street hotel, a very seedy hotel, and then disappear for a weekend at a metropole to have amorous activities which are clandestine in quality, right? Not healthy or life-giving in quality. Okay, so the expected guest is coming, and we are about to see again an example of a very decadent sexual activity, a very decadent sexual scene. He, the young man carbuncular arrives. So carbuncular, he's got a lot of carbuncles, which is to say he's got a skin problem. He's got a situation in the skin which is unhealthy in quality. It can come out of indigestion, it can come out of a loss of appetite, it can emerge out of all kinds of different things. But it's a symptom of unhealthiness, it's a symptom of degeneration, this carbuncular condition of the young man. He, the young man carbuncular, arrives, a small house agent's clerk. So who is he? He's a house agent's clerk. So we have a typist, we have a clerk, and they represent the modernity over here. They represent the modern man and the modern female in this metropolis, right? So the female is a clerk, the female is a typist, sorry, and the man is a clerk, and they come together to have some very quick sex, essentially, after which he'll disappear. A small house agent's clerk with one bold stare, one of the law on whom assurance sits, as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. So he's someone who carries the legal voice of insurance, assurance, etc. So he's a clerk. The time is not propitious, and as he guesses, the meal is ended. She is bored and tired, endeavors to engage her in caresses, which still are unproved, unreproved, if undesired, flushed and decided, he assaults at once, exploring hands encounter no defense. His vanity requires no response. So again, look at the passive performance of sex over here. So he assaults her. The word assault is important. It's an example of sexual violence. And we come back to the image of Philomel over here, the woman, the archetypal female figure who is violated by the man, by the powerful man, by the privileged man. And she is helpless against this male sexual violence, this predatory male sexual violence, which is something which is replayed in modern times in the image of the typist whose body has been attacked by the clerk. And it's actually a very decadent and sad scene where the entire activity of sex has been described as a very mechanistic thing without any consent, and this is just an attack, and it's undesired, and it just goes on as a passive thing, which is a very dark reflection of modernity, a very dark reflection of modern human relationships, modern human intimacy, where there's a complete crisis in communication. There's no reciprocity, there's no dialogic quality, and it's just an assault on the female body, a very quick assault, a very quick gratification, after which it leaves, right? And that's how the whole entire scene is played out over here. His vanity requires no response. So my published article in Wasteland has a title, Exploring Hands Encounter No Defense. If you Google me up and you write this line, Exploring Hands Encounter No Defense, it will show up. It was published in a journal called Peer English, which is brought up by Leicester University, UK. And I'm happy to upload it in a portal if you wish to read it, which gives a very which deals with this particular scene essentially, and it talks about how human relationships, how human sexual relationships degenerate in Wasteland to the extent that everything becomes a machinic engagement. It's like a typewriter and a pen coming together. So the typist is essentially the typewriter, and the clerk over here is just someone who is carrying out a very quick assault on the female body, and after which he leaves. Okay. And I, Tiresias, have full suffered all, enacted on the same divan or bed, I who have sat by the thieves below the wall and walked among the lowest of the dead. Bestows one final patronizing kiss and gropes his way, finding the stairs unlit. Again, the verbs are very interesting. Assault, grope, all these verbs are examples of predatory sexual behavior or sexual violence, right? So which don't necessarily have consent, and very, very dark, sinister activities. And also look at the way in which Tiresias, who had seen hell, who had seen the mythical quality of hell, the mythical landscape of hell, now finds himself situated in his modern urban setting, modern urban decadent setting, and he can see everything together. For him, time is one continuum, this mythical time, historical time, and contemporary time. So every time, all the different dimensions of time come together in Tiresias. He who had sat by the thieves, and now I'm sitting in London in this little apartment, this very decadent, claustrophobic apartment, and seeing this very quick sex or sexual activity which doesn't have any love, doesn't have any intimacy, and obviously reflects the degeneration of human relationships at a very, very dark, sinister level. And if you come back and see the aftermath of this activity, what happens as a fallout of this activity, and that becomes even darker in quality. And this is the focus comes back on the woman over here. She turns and looks a moment in the glass. The lover is gone. He had groped his way down the stairs. Again, the word grope is a classic verb for predatory sexual activity, just like assault is. And before that, there was a patronizing kiss. There's no love, this complete act of lovelessness, which has been described over here. And after he goes away, what happens to her? She turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of a departed lover. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Again, very, very important. The passivity is very, very important. The inertia is very, very important. And if you remember, if you go back to the preludes, the poem that we did, the image of the quote-unquote fallen woman, who had just suddenly had this glimpse of a life as an epiphanic moment flickering on the screen like a cinema image. Prior to that and even after that, everything is very, very passive. Her body is very, very passive. Her awareness of her own body is very, very passive because she's constantly trampled by insistent feet, if you remember the lines from Preludes. And the act of being trampled upon, obviously means that you become a reserver and receiver of violence at a very bodily level. And that numbs you, essentially. So if you constantly get more and more violence given to your body, and if you internalize violence as a woman, a time comes when everything becomes half-formed, when your brain is unable to create a fully formed thought. Everything becomes a half-formed thought. And her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Again, look at the very machinic metaphors over here. It's not a mind, it's a brain. Okay, and there's a very big difference, as you know. The brain is this neural organism, this neural machine, or this neural net of combinations, electrochemical combinations, and that allows one half-formed thought to pass. It's like an electric circuit allowing a signal to pass. It's the same thing, that same metaphor, the same rhetoric is being used over here to describe the human mind, which has been described as a neural net, which is allowing a half-formed electrochemical reaction to pass. Okay, it's that mechanistic in quality. Okay. and hardly aware of a departed lover. This half awareness, this half formed thought, and obviously these become reflections of a numbed existence, a numbed modernity in the metropolis, right? So again, we go back to George Simel's seminal work on the metropolis and mental life, where he talked about the modern condition of modernity as a neurotic condition, as an example of neurosis, okay? And that's something which you find over here as well. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. When lovely woman stoops to folly and paces about the room again alone, she smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on a gramophone. Again, automatic hand is very, very important. The mechanistic movement, the mechanistic motor movement is very, very important. Even the motor movement is automatic in quality. Even the motor movement is mechanized in quality, right? And this mechanization of motor movement is a reflection of the numbness of modernity, right? So this is a numbed human condition where you don't really have any feeling. So the entire sentient human quality is being numbed away, and all you can have is half-formed thoughts and half awarenesses and automatic motor movements maneuvering with what is around you, right? So this is like a motor maneuver which is quite automatic in quality, and that automatism is an important thing over here. And this is what I mean when I say the human body, the human motor movement, the human limbs, the human awareness, the human consciousness, everything is converted into a mechanistic existence by this metropolis. Okay, so and then we come back to the end of this poem, this particular section, where the reference to Carthage, then I come, burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest burning. So the reference over here is Saint Augustine, Saint Augustine's Confessions, which is a collection of his writings. Now, the whole idea of burning away is an example of purgation, which connects to the title of this particular section, Fire Sermon, which is essentially a message from the Buddha, Gautam Buddha, which is essentially about how to control bodily desires, how to control your sexual desires, and how to sublimate your sexual desires into something more substantial, something more mystical, something more spiritual. And this connection between Buddha and Saint Augustine is important over here, because we're looking at two different dimensions of philosophy. One, Eastern philosophy represented by Buddha, and we have Western philosophy represented by Saint Augustine. And the connection over here is very, very important, because in a Wasteland, by the time the poem ends, you'll find that the poem ends with a reference to the Gita, the Upanishad, the Gita, where there's a reference to Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. That is what the speaker says in the end. So this entire gaze towards Eastern philosophy is important, where we're looking at the way in which bodily desire, sexual desires can be converted, can be sublimated into something more redemptive in quality. So this whole idea of burning, 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 burning is a reference to purgation, reference to the burning flesh, which is essentially about the degenerative sexual desire, which is getting burned away. And then we move towards the Lord over here, towards a spiritual existence, which can sublimate you into a better existential level. And this reference to Saint Augustine is important, because if you look at the historical Saint Augustine, I mean, he moved, like Buddha, for instance, he moved into spirituality after an experience, after an entire life of lust, after an entire life of earthly pleasures. And only after he was exhausted of all lively pleasures, exhausted of all lusty pleasures, he moved into spirituality, just like Buddha did. So Gautam Buddha, if you remember, he was a prince when he was born, and he grew up in his entire life of lust and luxury and all kinds of earthly pleasures. And only after he grew exhausted of it, he got the enlightenment to move away from that earthly pleasure into something more spiritual, something more sustainable, right? So the entire movement from sexuality to spirituality is something which is represented over here through two different historical and philosophical figures, right? So one, the Eastern philosophical figure of Gautam Buddha, and a Western one of Saint Augustine. And again, what the poem does over here, it makes a combination of two different schools of philosophy, both aiming to do the same thing, the movement away from sexuality into spirituality, which is what the Wasteland is all about. So burning over here becomes an example and experience of purgation, and only through purgation can you reach elevation, can you reach the example of a state of spirituality. So if you take a look at the Dantesque model of divine comedy, so Inferno followed by Purgatorio, and at the end you reach Paradiso, right? So the Italian words for Inferno, Purgatorio, Paradiso. You can only reach paradise only after you go through purgation of the entire experience of burning away your sins, burning away your fleshly desires, burning away your earthly desires. only after you burn away everything can you reach the paradisal condition, the paradiso in Dante's Divine Comedy, right? So we have a similar kind of experience of purgation described over here. So this concludes the third section of Wasteland, the Fire Sermon. We move on to the next section, the next lecture. We just go through it again and connect it to the entire poem. For instance, the burial of the dead, and then followed by the second section and the third section. We find as a continuum across the entire poem, which makes it such a moving poem. It's one of the greatest poems written in modern times, and it's one of the most articulate voices of modernity, Western European modernity, and the decadence of modernity as a spiritual condition is something which Eliot's poem depicts very graphically and very compellingly. So I'll see you the next section with the next section, the next lecture. Thank you for your attention.